In the early hours of August 13, 2018, the town of Frederick, Colorado, woke up the same way it always did. The air was still, the streets were quiet, identical houses lined identical roads, each with trimmed lawns, closed garages, and the unspoken promise of safety that defines suburban America. This was the kind of place where people believed nothing truly terrible could happen. The house at 2825 Saratoga Trail looked no different. No broken windows, no forced entry, no screaming heard in the night, no visible sign of violence, just absence. And absence in criminal investigation is often the loudest signal of all. The first alarm was not raised by police, but by intuition. Shanann Watts was not answering her phone. To most people, that would mean very little, but to those who knew her, it meant everything. Shanann was not someone who disappeared without explanation. She lived her life in constant motion, documented online in real time, messages, videos, photos, updates. Her phone was an extension of her presence. When Shanann went silent, something was wrong. No texts, no social media activity, no response. By mid-morning, concern turned into urgency. Police were called. Officers arrived at the house and stepped inside. What they found was not chaos, but order. Shoes still by the door. Purse inside the home. Phone located. Children's car seats still installed in the vehicle. Everything a mother would never leave behind. But Shanann was gone, and so were her two daughters, Bella, 4 years old, and Celeste, just 3. From an investigative standpoint, this was not a voluntary disappearance. Mothers do not leave without their children. Pregnant women do not vanish without their belongings. Families do not simply erase themselves overnight. And then there was the man standing right there in the house, answering questions calmly, guiding officers from room to room, speaking softly, appearing cooperative. Chris Watts. Chris Watts did not look like a suspect. He looked like what society is trained to trust: thin, quiet, polite. He spoke in measured sentences. He did not resist. He did not argue. He did not panic. He acted like a husband worried about his missing family. But to experienced investigators, his behavior stood out. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was controlled. In the early hours of a genuine family disappearance, loved ones unravel. They cry. They beg. They lose composure. Chris did not. His voice remained level. His answers were careful. His body language closed in on itself, but never broke. That calmness was not proof of guilt, but it was a signal. Soon after, a local news crew arrived. Chris stood on his front porch, speaking directly into the camera. He asked for his wife and children to come home. He said he loved them. He said he wanted them safe. There were no tears, no cracking voice, no urgency. "I just want them to come back," he said. To investigators, that sentence mattered. Innocent people speak in certainty. They say, "When my family comes home," people who already know the ending speak in conditionals. "If I just want." The neighborhood, meanwhile, remained still. No one had heard screaming. No one had seen strangers. No one had noticed anything unusual in the night. That silence narrowed the scope of the investigation rapidly. Then the first piece of objective data arrived. A neighbor's security camera showed Chris backing his truck into the garage early that morning, an unusual habit for him. The footage was grainy, distant, limited, but it captured something important. Chris moved back and forth repeatedly, bending down, lifting objects the camera could not clearly identify. No one else appeared in the frame. No Shanann. No children. In criminal investigation, what is missing from footage can be as important as what appears. Next, came the GPS data from Chris's company vehicle. It showed him driving to a remote oil site shortly after dawn, a location tied directly to his job, far from public view and entirely familiar to him. Each detail alone meant very little. Cameras malfunction. GPS data can mislead. Silence can have innocent explanations. But investigations are not built on single facts. They are built on patterns, and a pattern was forming. As detectives began examining the Watts marriage more closely, they found not a home defined by chaos, but by emotional withdrawal. Financial strain, tension beneath the surface. A third pregnancy, adding pressure to a relationship already stretched thin. But there were no public explosions, no police calls, no domestic violence reports. What existed instead was something far more dangerous: unresolved silence. Chris Watts did not argue. He did not confront. He did not express anger outwardly. He withdrew. And in the psychology of violent crime, that kind of withdrawal is often where the most destructive decisions are made. While Shanann believed the marriage was struggling but salvageable, Chris had already emotionally exited the relationship. Long before that morning, long before she returned home. By the end of August 13, the town of Frederick continued its daily routine. Kids went to school. Adults went to work. The world outside Saratoga Trail moved forward, but inside one quiet house, a family had vanished, not because of an intruder, not because of an accident, but because something had broken from within. And that was only the beginning. Underscore, 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 underscore. If the public record were the only source, the Watts family would look like a model of suburban success. Smiling photos, birthday videos, family trips, a pregnant mother documenting milestones, two small children laughing into a phone camera, and behind them, often just outside the center of the frame, a quiet husband with a restrained smile. That husband was Chris Watts, and the woman holding the camera was Shanann Watts. But investigators know better than to trust appearances. Social media does not show truth. It shows intention. It shows what people want others to believe. And in this case, it showed a marriage already hollowed out from the inside. The collapse of the Watts marriage did not arrive through shouting matches or physical violence. It arrived quietly. It settled in through avoidance, through silence, through a man who learned to nod instead of speak, to agree instead of resist. Shanann was assertive, organized, vocal. She managed schedules, finances, family life. Chris, by contrast, retreated. He complied. He avoided confrontation. He let decisions be made for him. For years, this dynamic appeared functional, but beneath it, resentment accumulated without release. In criminal psychology, this pattern is well documented. Individuals who avoid conflict outwardly often create a private internal world where anger is stored rather than expressed. Without an outlet, that anger does not fade. It sharpens. By the time investigators reviewed messages and behavioral changes, it was clear that Chris Watts had emotionally disengaged long before his family disappeared. He stopped communicating. He became distant. He withdrew affection. Shanann noticed. She reached out. She tried to reconnect, but she was speaking to someone who had already left the marriage in his mind. Then came the turning point. At work, Chris began a relationship with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger. To investigators, this was not simply an affair. It was a psychological pivot. Nicole represented a version of life without responsibility. No children, no financial strain, no marital expectations, no history. With her, Chris could imagine himself unburdened, unaccountable, rewritten. This is where the danger escalated. Instead of seeing his marriage as something to fix or end, Chris began to mentally reframe it as an obstacle. This process, known as moral disengagement, allows an individual to detach emotionally from people they once loved by redefining them as problems to be solved. Text messages revealed the shift. Chris no longer spoke about his family with warmth. He spoke about logistics, about being trapped, about wanting freedom. His language lost empathy. His tone became transactional. What he did not do is equally important. He did not consult a divorce attorney. He did not plan separation. He did not discuss custody, because those paths required consequences. Public failure, financial responsibility, a permanent change to his good guy image. For men like Chris Watts, image matters more than truth. As Shanann traveled for work, Chris lived as though his old life had already ended. He went out with Nicole. He talked about trips, about starting fresh, about a future that did not include a wife or children. This dual existence, one foot in reality, one in fantasy, is a critical stage in family annihilation cases. Once the fantasy feels more real than the present becomes disposable. Meanwhile, Shanann sensed the distance, but did not understand its depth. She messaged Chris. She expressed concern. She spoke about the baby. She believed the relationship could be repaired. She did not know that. In Chris's internal narrative, repair was no longer an option. The pregnancy made the situation irreversible in his mind. Another child meant deeper responsibility, more visibility, more obligation. Time, as he perceived it, was running out. From an investigative perspective, this is the moment where thought becomes trajectory, where internal justification begins to solidify into intent. Chris Watts did not snap. He did not lose control. He moved toward a conclusion, slowly, deliberately, and in silence. By the time Shanann returned home on the night of August 12, she was returning to a marriage she believed was strained but intact. Chris was waiting in a house where the decision had already been made. No argument needed to happen. No confrontation was required. The emotional separation had already done its work, and when silence has fully replaced empathy, violence does not announce itself. It arrives quietly. What happened next unfolded, not as chaos, but as execution. That night would not end in conversation. It would end in erasure. The night of August 12, 2018, did not announce itself as the beginning of a massacre. There were no storms over Frederick, Colorado. No raised voices carried through open windows. No neighbors startled awake by violence. The streets remained still, wrapped in the false security of routine. Shortly after midnight, Shanann Watts arrived home from a business trip. Her flight had been delayed. She was exhausted, 15 weeks pregnant. Carrying her luggage through the front door of the house on Saratoga Trail, she moved with the familiarity of someone returning to safety. A neighbor's security camera captured the moment she entered the house. It would be the last time she was seen alive. From an investigative standpoint, what matters most about that night is not spectacle, but absence. There were no signs of a struggle large enough to alert neighbors, no emergency calls, no broken furniture. That tells investigators something crucial. Whatever happened unfolded under conditions of trust. In cases of domestic homicide, trust is often the final vulnerability. Victims do not defend themselves against those they believe will not hurt them. Inside the house, There was no evidence of a prolonged argument, no indication of panic. This was not a spontaneous eruption of rage. It was the end point of a psychological process already completed. By the time Shanann returned, Chris Watts was not deciding what to do. That decision had already been made. What followed was not loud, it was controlled. In the early hours before dawn, Chris began moving with purpose. He backed his work truck into the garage, an unusual action for him, but one that reduced visibility. A neighbor's camera recorded him walking back and forth between the house and the vehicle. He bent down, lifted items, loaded them into the truck bed. The footage was distant and indistinct, but its significance lay in what never appeared. Shanann never walked out, neither did Bella, nor Celeste. In homicide investigations, absence from visual records can be as damning as presence. When people vanish from the frame entirely, investigators ask why. At approximately 5:27 a.m., Chris drove away from the house. GPS data later confirmed his route. He did not drive randomly. He went directly to an oil site tied to his job, a remote location, familiar, isolated, and under his control. This choice would become one of his greatest mistakes. Criminals often believe familiarity equals safety. In reality, it creates traceability. Vehicles, access logs, location data, work schedules. Every system designed for efficiency becomes a witness. While Chris was en route, the town of Frederick was beginning its day. Lights turned on, coffee brewed, school routines prepared. Normal life continued, unaware that an entire family had already been erased. By the time Chris arrived at the oil site, he was operating in what investigators later described as task mode. This psychological state allows individuals to perform morally unthinkable actions by reducing them to procedural steps. Emotion is shut down. Empathy is suspended. Action replaces reflection. From this point forward, the details would later be reconstructed through confession, forensic evidence, and digital records. But the emotional truth was already clear. The violence did not occur because of loss of control. It occurred because control had been fully claimed. Later that morning, Chris returned home and resumed the role he had prepared for. He answered messages, responded to calls, spoke to coworkers. When police arrived, he welcomed them inside. He did not behave like someone who had just lost everything. He behaved like someone managing a narrative. In interviews, his language was notably detached. He spoke of his wife and children as if they were temporarily misplaced, rather than gone. His tone was flat, his expressions minimal. This emotional incongruence is one of the earliest indicators investigators watch for in suspected family annihilators. When asked questions, Chris answered politely. He did not volunteer information. He did not interrupt. He allowed silence to sit in the room, believing incorrectly that silence would protect him. But modern investigations do not rely on demeanor alone. They rely on systems. The neighbor's camera footage contradicted his account. The GPS data showed precise movements inconsistent with his story. Phone records revealed abrupt communication cutoffs. Each data point, by itself, could be explained away. Together, they formed a closed loop. By the end of August 13, investigators were no longer searching for a missing family. They were building a homicide case. Chris Watts had not yet been arrested, but in practical terms, the perimeter had closed. He was the last person to see his family alive, the only one with access, the only one whose movements aligned with their disappearance. What he did not yet understand was that the most dangerous place he would soon enter was not a crime scene. It was a small room with a table, a chair, and no way to escape his own words, because once silence is broken, not by evidence, but by psychology, it does not return. The interrogation room at the Frederick Police Department was not designed to intimidate. It was small, neutral, fluorescent lights, a table, a few chairs, no raised voices, no threats, no physical pressure. But for someone carrying a secret that large, it was one of the most dangerous rooms in the building. When Chris Watts sat down inside that room, he still believed he was in control. He had spoken to officers all day. He had spoken to reporters. He had repeated the same version of events calmly and consistently. He believed cooperation would protect him. This is a common miscalculation among family annihilators with no criminal history. They mistake politeness for credibility. They believe that being agreeable can substitute for truth. The detectives did not rush. They did not accuse. They let Chris talk. They allowed him to repeat himself. They watched how he phrased things, how he avoided certain words, how he spoke about his family without urgency, without emotional escalation. Experienced investigators know that lies are rarely exposed by confrontation. They are exposed by time. Chris, said Shannon, had taken the children somewhere, that she needed space, that he did not know where they were. His story remained vague, deliberately incomplete. He avoided details because details create risk. What was missing was just as telling as what was said. Chris did not ask if his children were safe. He did not demand updates. He did not show fear. Instead, he spoke as if events were already concluded. At a calculated moment, investigators introduced a variable Chris had not prepared for. His father. This was not an emotional ambush. It was a strategic one. The presence of a parent reactivates identity. It pulls the subject out of role, playing and back into moral self-perception. When the door closed and the detectives stepped away, the atmosphere shifted. Chris's posture changed. His voice softened. His eyes dropped. The confident narrative he had rehearsed all day began to fracture. He told his father a new version of the story. In this version, Shannon was no longer missing. She was responsible. Chris claimed she had harmed the children, and that he had reacted, that he had lost control, that he had no choice. To investigators, this was not a breakthrough. It was a transitional lie. This type of confession is well documented in violent crime. When the psychological burden becomes too heavy, offenders often admit to a version of the truth that still preserves a sense of moral superiority. By blaming the victim, they attempt to minimize their own culpability. But transitional lies are unstable. They require precision. They collapse under scrutiny. When detectives returned and began asking specific questions, the story could not hold. Timelines conflicted. Physical details did not align. Emotional responses remained incongruent. As the questioning continued, Chris's resistance weakened. His breathing changed. His sentences shortened. The pauses between answers grew longer. Eventually, the structure gave way. Chris admitted to killing Shannon. Then he admitted to killing his children. There was no dramatic outburst, no emotional breakdown. The words came out flat, almost procedural, as if he were listing completed tasks rather than describing irreversible acts. This emotional detachment is one of the most chilling aspects of family annihilation. By the time the confession occurs, the psychological separation has already been completed. The offender no longer experiences the victims as emotionally real. To the detectives, the confession brought no relief, only confirmation the worst possibility had been correct. Chris described his actions without visible remorse, without tears, without hesitation. The calmness that had initially seemed like cooperation was revealed for what it truly was: emotional disconnection. Outside the interrogation room, the case moved quickly. Evidence aligned. Search operations shifted from rescue to recovery. The narrative presented to the public unraveled. The man who had stood on his porch asking for his family to return was no longer a worried husband. He was the one who ensured they never would. For the community of Frederick, the realization was devastating. Neighbors replayed conversations. News footage was re-examined. The question echoed everywhere: how could no one have seen this coming? The answer was not hidden in a single moment. It was spread across years of silence, years of emotional withdrawal mistaken for harmlessness, years of conflict avoidance interpreted as kindness. By the time Chris Watts was placed under arrest, the legal case was effectively over. But the psychological impact was only beginning. Because this was not just a crime, it was a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth that the most extreme violence can exist behind the calmest appearances. When Chris Watts entered the courtroom in Colorado to receive his sentence, there was no dramatic confrontation, no drawn-out legal battle, no last-minute reversal. The proceedings moved quickly, almost clinically. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders of Shanann Watts, her 2 daughters, and the unborn child she carried. The legal process ended that day. The consequences did not. Outside the courtroom, the world struggled to absorb what had happened. News footage replayed endlessly. Images of a smiling family contrasted against mugshots and police tape. The dissonance was unbearable. People searched for explanations that could restore order to a story that refused to make sense. In Frederick, Colorado, the house on Saratoga Trail became a place of mourning. Candles appeared on the sidewalk. Flowers, stuffed animals, notes written by strangers who had never met the family but who felt compelled to acknowledge the loss not just of lives but of certainty. Because the most unsettling aspect of the Watts case was not the violence itself. It was how ordinary everything had seemed before it happened. In criminology, Chris Watts is categorized as a family annihilator. The term is precise but emotionally insufficient. It describes the act, not the unease it leaves behind. Watts did not fit the public's image of danger. He had no criminal record, no history of abuse, no visible rage. He was trusted. He was familiar. That is the legacy of this case. The realization that extreme violence does not always come with warning signs we recognize. That danger does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it nods. Sometimes it agrees with everything you say, while quietly detaching from every emotional bond. After sentencing, Chris Watts was transferred to a maximum security prison. There, his life became rigidly structured, controlled, monitored. The freedom he believed he could claim by erasing his family was replaced by confinement without end. Time, which he once thought he could reset, became his permanent environment. But the true sentence extended far beyond prison walls. For investigators, the case became a reference point, a reminder that emotional withdrawal can be more dangerous than open conflict. That silence, when paired with entitlement and avoidance, can evolve into something lethal. For families watching from afar, the case forced uncomfortable reflection. How well do we really know the people we live with? How often do we mistake compliance for stability? How easily do we dismiss emotional absence as harmless introversion? The Watts murders did not happen because of a single argument or a sudden loss of control. They happened because of a sustained refusal to confront reality, because one man chose erasure over accountability, because silence was allowed to replace dialogue for too long. Bella and Celeste became symbols of innocence betrayed, children who trusted without question. Shanann became the face of a woman who believed she was returning home to safety, to family, unaware that the danger was already inside. And Chris Watts became something far more disturbing than a monster. He became a reminder that the most catastrophic violence can grow quietly, inside lives that appear normal, inside homes that look safe, inside people who never raised their voices. The documentary ends without resolution because there is none. No explanation fully satisfies. No sentence restores what was lost. What remains is a question, one that lingers long after the final frame fades to black. How many tragedies begin not with anger, but with silence?